This video contains mature content. Viewer discretion is advised. The Blood Telegram by Gary J. Bass. Pakistan. Pakistan was stunned by its military defeat. The population was in shock, dazed and resentful. During the war, the state-controlled press had falsely told Pakistanis that their army was winning. When the government abruptly lifted censorship, Pakistanis were unprepared for the hard slap of reality. They suddenly learned about the army's atrocities and military defeats, leaving people disillusioned and disgusted. This second partition was devastating for Pakistan. They know that India was the midwife of Bangladesh. Says Scott Butcher, the junior political officer in the U.S. consulate in Dhaka back in 1971. India defeated the military, which is proud. That was a real sock in the gut for Pakistani dignity. They lost half their country and more than half their population. Yahya himself was so much in denial that he defiantly vowed to keep fighting for the East. But in the city streets of what had been West Pakistan and was now simply a truncated Pakistan, crowds screamed for Yahya and his cronies to be put on trial as traitors. Infuriated by Yahya's drinking, mobs in Karachi burned liquor stores. The CIA reported that some of the military and the public thought he should commit suicide. Days after Dhaka fell, Nixon's friend reluctantly announced that he was resigning, swept aside by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Despite his electoral success back in 1970, Bhutto came to Pakistan's presidency under a cloud. Some Pakistanis blamed him for an aggressive obduracy in the constitutional negotiations that had helped lead to the current catastrophe. Piling on the humiliation, India worked energetically to frame the defeat as a foundational challenge to Pakistan's ideal of itself as an Islamic nation. Indian thinkers rejected Pakistan's two-nation theory. The belief that Hindus and Muslims comprised two distinct nations, which Haxer called the purest fiction ever invented by the human mind. The creation of Bangladesh has sounded a death knell to the so-called two-nation theory. Gloated a senior Indian diplomat, rubbishing the concept of Pakistan as an Islamic state. Although Indians underestimated Pakistan's reliance on other ideals such as nationalist modernization, Pakistanis still grapple with this breakdown. More than a decade after the war, the journalist Tariq Ali wrote, "The two nations theory, formulated in the middle-class living rooms of Uttar Pradesh, was buried in the Bengali countryside." Nor did Pakistani leaders believe that India was done hammering them. In June 1971, Swaran Singh, India's foreign minister, had secretly told his diplomats about other ways to crack up West Pakistan itself, by stirring up rebellion in restive areas such as Balochistan and the northwest frontier province, hoping to get those places to follow Bangladesh's lead. After the success of Indian intelligence in covertly sponsoring the Mukti Bahini, Indian officials pushed to expand the use of the spy agencies more widely. Disastrously, this came to include raw sponsorship of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, who went on to assassinate Rajiv Gandhi. Among the Mandarins in India's ruling circles, Jaswant Singh is one of the most sympathetic to Pakistani fears. He says, "Now when you say, 'Come on, it's over,' why do you sink yourself into this hellhole of state-sponsored terrorism? Why do you try to kill India with 1,000 cuts? Friends in Pakistan tell me, well, we can't forget, 71. It simmers." Arundhati Gose, Hax's protégé at the Indian Foreign Ministry, says, "We haven't yet absorbed that the Pakistanis today are not thinking about partition anymore. It's 71 that they agonize about. That's what they hold against India. That we split their country. It was already difficult, but it's a very powerful thing from the Pakistani side of it. There's terrible resentment. We don't seem to be aware of it." This trauma could have been an opportunity for self-examination in Pakistan. As one of Yahya's ministers later wrote, "The Pakistan Army's brutal actions can never be condoned or justified in any way. The Army's murderous campaign in which many thousands of innocent people including women, the old and sick, and even children, were brutally murdered while millions fled from their homes to take shelter either in remote places or in India, constituted a measureless tragedy." Days after the shooting stopped, Bhutto set up a judicial commission to investigate the battlefield defeat in East Pakistan. Led by Pakistan's Chief Justice as well as two other eminent judges, it produced a scathing official record condemning the military for corruption, turpitude, and brutality, and demanding courts-martial for Yahya, Niazi, and other disgraced military leaders. While the report concentrates on military defeats, it includes frank testimony on the atrocities from senior army officers and civilian officials. This judicial commission, convinced that there can be no doubt that a very large number of unprovoked and vindictive atrocities did in fact take place, urged Pakistan's government to set up a high-powered court or commission of inquiry. 2. Hold trials of those who indulged in these atrocities, brought a bad name to the Pakistan army and alienated the sympathies of the local population by their acts of wanton cruelty and immorality against our own people. But nothing happened. The report was so harsh on the military that it was suppressed, and only came to light in an Indian magazine in 2000 and in Karachi's Intrepid Dawn newspaper in 2001. While Bhutto was keen to discredit the likes of Yahya and Niazi, he, far from facing up to the horrors, refused to accept losing Bangladesh and insisted on the necessity of the crackdown. I would have done it with more intelligence, more scientifically, less brutally. Bhutto told an interviewer, heaping all blame on Yahya Khan and his gang of illiterate psychopaths. Bhutto put the notorious General Tika Khan in charge of the army, insisting that during the massacres, he was a soldier doing a soldier's job. Tika Khan later became a leader of the Pakistan People's Party. He denied not just the inflated Bangladeshi statistic of 3 million dead, but also the number of 10 million refugees, insisting that Indira Gandhi had sent people from West Bengal. As for the women who were raped and killed, he flatly said, "I don't believe it." While saying that such brutality against the people was unnecessary, Bhutto defended the use of force at home. You can't build without destroying. To build a country, Stalin was obliged to use force and kill. Mao Tse-tung was obliged to use force and kill. For liberal Pakistanis today, the year 1971 marks a failure to fashion a workable constitutional order. In Lahore's Friday Times, Najm Sethi, an outspoken liberal journalist, recently criticized Pakistan's effort to centralize its control in both the West and East wings, resulting in the exploitation and repression of the Bengalis. The consequence of this false start was disintegration of the country in 1971 and the rise of dangerous sub-nationalisms and separatisms in what remains of Pakistan. After all, the loss of East Pakistan, as grievous as that was always a rather likely event. Anatol Lieven, an eminent Pakistan expert with deep sympathy for the country, has thoughtfully argued that the real catastrophe was the terrible circumstances in which Bangladesh left, more like Yugoslavia than Czechoslovakia, not the fact that it did. The separation, he believes, was all but inevitable. But Pakistani remembrances of 1971 usually omit the military's own atrocities. The army, the big political parties, and many newspapers would all prefer to forget their responsibilities. Even someone as sophisticated as Benazir Bhutto remembered that, as a Harvard College student in 1971, she initially refused to believe American newspapers, and found security in the official jingoistic line in our part of the world that the reports in the Western press were exaggerated and a Zionist plot against an Islamic State. As she later forthrightly wrote, "How many times since have I asked God to forgive me for my ignorance?" To this day, the country's memories about its treatment of its former East Wing remain, as one leading Pakistani publication put it, shrouded in a fog of confusion, or lost in collective amnesia. Although upper-level textbooks can be much better, many of Pakistan's textbooks have whitewashed out the atrocities against Bengalis and falsely claimed that the United States wanted Pakistan divided. In the big cities, there is more awareness. In cosmopolitan Lahore, a recent poll found that 79% of youthful respondents remember that East Pakistan was treated unfairly. But overall, just 38% of young Pakistanis say that East Pakistan was dealt with unfairly, while 19% say it was treated fairly, and 40% simply do not know. This was the rubble out of which Bhutto had to rebuild his country. He sought out a new national identity and new foreign friends. Perhaps the most bizarre outcome of Nixon's and Kissinger's hell-bent support of Pakistan was that its new president and many of his fellow citizens felt betrayed by the United States. Bhutto had long been anti-American, but Pakistan's dismemberment redoubled his suspicions. During the Civil War, many Pakistani elites and army officers had seen the United States as fickle at best, or secretly scheming to rip Pakistan apart. Lieutenant General A.K. Niazi, who surrendered to the Indian generals, bitterly claimed that his troops could have held out if not betrayed by conspiracies, and wrote that his humiliation suited the Americans. Other Pakistanis discerned a shadowy American plot, sometimes blamed in part on American Jews, to dismember their country. This is perplexing and unfair. Whatever else might be said of them, Nixon and Kissinger cannot be faulted for any lack of commitment to Pakistan. In everything we do with Yahya, Kissinger directed the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan. We cannot have it said that we stabbed Pakistan in the back. This must be your guiding principle. Kissinger instructed George H.W. Bush that Nixon doesn't want anyone to say we pushed Pakistan over the edge. During the war, Bhutto told Kissinger that, "We are completely satisfied with U.S. backing," and promised a lavish show of appreciation when peace came. But Nixon's and Kissinger's kind of support was not likely to win over ordinary Pakistanis. Their most enthusiastic acts on behalf of Pakistan, encouraging Chinese military mobilization and illegal arms transfers through Iran and Jordan, were so secret that hardly anyone in Pakistan could have known about them. And the most conspicuous U.S. support went to the junta, not the public, even when Yahya showed contempt for democratic election results in both wings of the country. This was fundamentally an alliance with Yahya and his generals. When they were ousted and discredited, it left little popular goodwill. Instead, Bhutto's Pakistan cooled toward the United States and turned to other countries for succor. In 1972, China used its first United Nations Security Council veto to block the United Nations from admitting Bangladesh, which China saw as a breakaway province no better than Taiwan. The United States, yielding to reality, would not go so far. At the same time, Bhutto cast his lot with friendly Muslim countries, culminating in a Gala Islamic summit in Lahore in 1974 for leaders such as Hafiz al-Assad of Syria, Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, and Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya, who declared that Pakistan was the citadel of Islam in Asia. In 1973, Pakistan got a new constitution including some distinctly Islamic inflections, which grew more extreme during the ideological dictatorship of Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, the general who overthrew Bhutto in a military coup in July 1977. Today the loss of Bangladesh is widely remembered in Pakistan as an early American betrayal, presaging a long series of them, a tepid U.S. response to India's nuclear test in 1974, U.S. support for Zia's authoritarianism, sanctions against Pakistan's nuclear program, backing for Pervez Musharraf's military regime in the aftermath of the September 2001 terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, and ongoing drone strikes. From the standard Pakistani nationalist viewpoint, in 1971, despite all of Pakistan's help with Nixon's opening to China, the United States was at best useless in preventing the loss of half the country. Some Indian strategists had hoped that a dismembered and defeated Pakistan would be finished as a threat. But despite Pakistan's losses, and some 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war, it rearmed and girded for future confrontation. Although Indira Gandhi's government had to insincerely welcome Bhutto as a democratically elected president, his fear and hostility toward India were radically increased. Under Bhutto, defense spending rocketed up. Just over 2 months after the war, the Indian Army saw that Pakistan was replacing its losses, modernizing its tank units, and bolstering its infantry. A defeated army will naturally seek revenge to restore its image in the country. General Sam Manekshaw said, "They will therefore want another round of hostilities for which we should be fully prepared." Gandhi, bargaining from strength, met Bhutto in a summit at Simla in June 1972. He brought along his daughter, Benazir Bhutto. Although they sparred over Kashmir, she gave him generous terms: the return of some 5,000 square miles of Pakistani territory seized by Indian troops, and the repatriation of 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war, with the approval of Mujib's government in Bangladesh. Many Indians were startled by Bhutto's success at Simla, with the opposition arguing that Gandhi had lost at the negotiating table what the army had won in war. But the Indian Foreign Ministry hailed the Simla Agreement as a generous peace, not imposed on the defeated, the diametrical opposite of the punitive Treaty of Versailles. Bhutto assured her that he would get his people to accept the upgrading of the line of control in Kashmir into an actual border, but then gave a hardline speech about Kashmir. Pervez Musharraf, a young Pakistani commando officer during the 1971 war, flung his jacket on the floor in disgust at the humiliating defeat. He wanted revenge against India, something still on his mind in 1999 when he seized power in a military coup to become Pakistan's military dictator. The old vendetta between Pakistan and India, freshly intensified after 1971, has had terrible consequences far beyond the region. The rout of Pakistan's army drove home as never before to Pakistan's leadership the need for alternative ways of fighting India. It did this in three ways, all of them tragic. First, the army, always strong, has become an overweening force in Pakistan's political life. After the humiliating skunking of Pakistan's military, Bhutto at first sought to limit the general's power. But confronted with an insurrection in Balochistan in 1973, Bhutto showed hardly more imagination than the far less intelligent Yahya, sending in some 80,000 troops. Once again, Pakistan went to war with its own people. In recent years, the generals have pushed aside civilian control and weakened the prospects for deepening democracy. We are almost a failed state. Musharraf recently said, "This is what democracy brings Pakistan." Second, Pakistan has turned to guerrillas and terrorists to carry on the struggle against India for Kashmir. Zia, who sought to install a politicized Islam at the core of Pakistan's politics, turned to young Islamist fighters as his beleaguered country's last hope against Indian and Soviet armies. After guerrillas proved successful against Soviet troops in Afghanistan, Pakistani intelligence deployed similar means against India in Kashmir. In the 1990s, Pakistan's powerful inter-services intelligence secretly backed and armed the Taliban, with the undeclared support of the Pakistan Army and much of the civilian leadership. By 1999, the Pakistan Army's chiefs were convinced that jihadists were the only reliable way to challenge the Indian Army, even indulging Osama bin Laden. Until 2001, the ISI nurtured Lashkar-e-Taiba, a terrorist group aiming against India but today with a much wider reach. Of course, this kind of covert sponsorship was out of India's playbook for the Mukti Bahini. Still, such support has proved to be a catastrophic strategy for Pakistan. Both inside and outside Pakistan's borders, terrorist attacks have become a grimly regular part of life, often from groups that have been the secret beneficiaries of the Pakistani state. Untold Pakistani civilians have been murdered. In Afghanistan today, Pakistan's fear of India drives some of the policies that are most dangerous to the United States. Pakistani politicians and generals worry that a rising India will dominate Afghanistan, leaving it with another hostile state on its border. To offset that, Pakistan's ISI has kept up its ties with the Taliban, which serves as a way of balancing India's influence in Afghanistan. Scott Butcher says, "You look at Afghanistan, it's all colored by Pakistan's fear of India." Third, there is Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. Bhutto had long argued that Pakistan needed its own atomic bomb, even if its people had to go hungry. Soon after losing the Bangladesh war, he decided to produce one. This was the genesis of the burgeoning nuclear program that has grown into one of the biggest nightmares of U.S. national security officials. Pakistan nurtures a growing arsenal of nuclear weapons and short-range missiles to deliver them, and is reckoned to have between 70 and 120 nuclear devices. When Benazir Bhutto was asked why nuclear weapons are popular among Pakistanis, she replied, "In 1971, our country was disintegrated." A.Q. Khan, the chief of Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, who remains a nationalist hero even though his smuggling network evidently sold nuclear technology to North Korea, Libya, and Iran, recently invoked the Bangladesh war as an apology for his dangerous brand of nuclear proliferation. Had Iraq and Libya been nuclear powers, they wouldn't have been destroyed in the way we have seen recently. If we had had nuclear capability before 1971, we would not have lost half of our country, present-day Bangladesh, after disgraceful defeat.